They called him a farmer. Then he ended a galactic war with a bag of seeds. The vast expanse of Coalition Fleet Command stretched across the asteroid belt like a metallic constellation against the void, each station and battleship representing the combined military might of 17 different species. Here, where the greatest tactical minds in the galaxy gathered to plan strategies that spanned star systems, the future of organic life itself hung in the balance. The Hegemony War had raged for 43 years, consuming entire civilizations and transforming peaceful worlds into graveyards of ash and twisted metal. In the gleaming corridors of the flagship, eternal vigilance beings with intellects that could process the movements of entire galactic arms walked with purpose and determination. Their neural implants pulsed with data streams that carried the weight of 1 trillion lives, their augmented minds calculating probabilities across dimensions that lesser species couldn't even comprehend. These were the architects of modern warfare masters of weapons that could crack planets like eggs and reshape the very fabric of space-time. And in BioBay 7, tending to a small hydroponic garden with soil-stained hands and the patience of someone who understood that life moved at its own pace, stood Daniel Cooper. At 31, he possessed the weathered features of a man who had spent his life working the earth, his hands bearing the calluses and scars that came from decades of coaxing sustenance from reluctant soil. He moved among the growing plants with an efficiency that spoke of deep understanding, checking nutrient levels and adjusting growth parameters with the kind of intuitive knowledge that couldn't be downloaded or programmed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who bothered to notice him. Here, in the heart of the most sophisticated military operation in galactic history, they had assigned farming duties to an actual farmer. Not because they respected his expertise, but because someone needed to grow vegetables for the crew, and manual labor was considered beneath the dignity of enhanced beings. Captain Zyron of the Thalcor warrior caste paused in the BioBay doorway, her forearms crossed in an expression of barely concealed disdain. Her people had evolved beyond the need for sustainable agriculture centuries ago, their warrior society sustained by conquest and tribute, rather than the patient cultivation of crops. To her, Daniel represented everything weak about lesser species, their dependence on slow biological processes, their attachment to planetary surfaces, their inability to simply take what they needed through superior firepower. Human, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never questioned the supremacy of military might. The Council requires increased protein production for the Arcturus offensive. Can your primitive methods accommodate this requirement? Daniel looked up from a tomato plant he'd been examining its leaves, showing signs of nitrogen deficiency that any experienced farmer would recognize immediately. Depends on what you're feeding the troops now, he replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who understood that nature had its own timeline. Nutrition isn't just about quantity. It's about balance, soil health, symbiotic relationships between different plant systems. Captain Jiren's expression hardened. We require efficiency, not philosophy. Unit 42 calculates that current production levels are suboptimal. From the Environmental Control Station, Unit 42's synthesized voice added its own assessment. Agricultural output remains within acceptable parameters for basic sustenance maintenance. However, recommended optimization protocols suggest replacing organic cultivation with synthetic nutrient production for improved efficiency. Daniel's hands never stopped moving as he adjusted the plant's support structure, his movements guided by decades of understanding that every living system required individual attention. Synthetic nutrients lack the micronutrient complexes that organic beings need for optimal health, he said quietly. Your soldiers might survive on artificial supplements, but they won't thrive. And in war, the difference between surviving and thriving can mean the difference between victory and defeat. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the coalition forces believed about military superiority and technological advancement. Captain Jiren's people had conquered 12 star systems through raw firepower and tactical brilliance, but they had never considered that their approach to warfare might be fundamentally flawed, that they might be missing something as basic as understanding how to properly nourish their own forces. Your concerns are noted, Captain Jiren replied dismissively. Focus on increasing yield. Leave strategy to those equipped to understand it. As she walked away, her metal-soled boots echoing against the deck plating, Daniel returned his attention to the garden, but his mind wasn't solely focused on plant health and growing cycles. For weeks now, he had been observing more than just the hydroponic systems. He had been watching the coalition's supply chains, studying their logistics reports, noting the patterns of resource distribution that kept 17 different species fed and operational across hundreds of star systems. And what he saw troubled him more than Captain Jiren's condescension or Unit 42's cold efficiency. The coalition's entire military strategy was built on a foundation that any farmer would recognize as fundamentally unsustainable. They consumed resources faster than they could be replenished, relied on supply lines that stretched across impossible distances, and operated under the assumption that superior firepower could compensate for any logistical shortcoming. It was Daniel realized exactly the kind of thinking that led to crop failures, soil depletion, and ecological collapse. The same mistakes that had been made by civilizations throughout history, the belief that technology could eliminate the need to understand and work with natural systems rather than against them. As he tended to his plants in the quiet of Bio Bay, 7 Daniel Cooper began to understand something that the galaxy's greatest military minds had missed. The hegemony war wouldn't be won through superior weapons or tactical brilliance. It would be won by whoever understood that all warfare ultimately came down to a simple question: who could keep their forces fed, healthy, and operational longer than their enemies? And that was a question any farmer knew how to answer. The recruitment center on Luna Station had been Daniel's last stop before shipping out to the front lines, a sterile complex of waiting rooms and processing stations where civilian specialists were sorted, cataloged, and assigned roles in the galaxy's largest military operation. Here, beings from dozens of worlds underwent the transformation from ordinary citizens to essential personnel, their skills evaluated, and their contributions measured against the relentless demands of warfare that spanned multiple star systems. Daniel had sat in the waiting area for 6 hours surrounded by individuals whose qualifications read like a catalog of advanced civilization quantum physicists who could manipulate matter at the subatomic level, tactical analysts whose enhanced minds could process battlefield data across 17 dimensions, bioengineers who could design organisms that existed in pure energy states. Their conversations filled the air with technical terminology that required translation algorithms for most species to understand discussions of concepts that pushed the boundaries of known science and engineering. When his name was finally called, Daniel had walked into the evaluation chamber carrying a single duffel bag containing his personal effects and a small collection of seeds from his farm on Earth. The contrast between his simple possessions and the advanced equipment surrounding him couldn't have been more stark. Molecular scanners that could analyze his genetic structure down to individual base pairs, neural interfaces that could map his thought patterns, in real-time assessment protocols that could measure his potential contribution to the war effort with mathematical precision. The evaluation officer, a Zentarian whose 3 eyes could perceive across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, had reviewed his file with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely concealed amusement. Agricultural specialist? The officer had read aloud, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Earth-based crop cultivation, soil management, sustainable farming practices. That's correct, Daniel had replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew his work's value even when others couldn't see it. And you believe these skills will be relevant to military operations conducted in space-based environments where traditional agriculture is impossible? Daniel had thought about his answer carefully, knowing that his response would determine whether he would be assigned meaningful work or relegated to the kind of make-work duties that kept unwanted personnel busy without actually contributing to the war effort. Food production is always relevant, he had said finally. Armies that can't eat don't fight very long. The officer's 3 eyes had focused on him with renewed attention, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The coalition maintains sophisticated supply chains and nutrient distribution systems. Our logistics networks can support military operations across multiple galaxies simultaneously. What could traditional farming methods possibly add to such advanced systems? Resilience, Daniel had answered without hesitation. Your supply chains work perfectly until they don't. Your distribution systems are efficient until they're disrupted. Your advanced methods are reliable until someone figures out how to break them. But a tomato plant doesn't need quantum processors or molecular assemblers. It just needs soil, water, and light. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable ones. The evaluation had continued for another hour, with the officer running Daniel through a series of tests designed to measure his adaptability, his problem-solving skills, and his ability to work under pressure. But Daniel had sensed that the real evaluation had ended with that first exchange, that everything else was simply bureaucratic procedure required to process his assignment. When the orders came through, they confirmed what he had expected: assignment to BioBay 7 aboard the flagship Eternal Vigilance duties, involving food production and nutritional support for crew requirements. It was by any measure exactly the kind of assignment given to personnel whose skills were considered useful, but not essential, important enough to justify their presence, but not significant enough to warrant serious considerations. Daniel had accepted the assignment with the same equanimity that had carried him through decades of farming, understanding that his value would be measured not by initial impressions, but by results. He had packed his seeds, carefully protecting them in specialized containers that would maintain their viability during the long journey to the front lines, and prepared himself for what he knew would be an uphill battle to prove that agricultural knowledge had a place in modern warfare. The journey to join Coalition Fleet Command had taken 3 weeks aboard a transport ship filled with other civilian specialists, each bringing their own expertise to a war effort that consumed knowledge as voraciously as it consumed resources. Daniel had spent most of the trip in the ship's small agricultural section, familiarizing himself with hydroponic systems and atmospheric processors that bore little resemblance to the open fields of his Earth farm, but operated on the same fundamental principles that had guided farming for thousands of years. His fellow passengers had ranged from curious to dismissive when they learned about his background. The quantum physicists had treated him with polite indifference, acknowledging his presence, but clearly failing to understand how traditional farming could be relevant to their sophisticated theories about manipulating matter and energy. The tactical analysts had been more openly skeptical, questioning why someone with such primitive skills had been assigned to the galaxy's most advanced military operation. But Daniel had also encountered a few individuals who understood the value of practical knowledge, specialists who had worked in environments where theoretical understanding had to be balanced with real-world application. A materials engineer from the Rigel system had spent hours discussing how soil chemistry principles could be applied to atmosphere processing. A logistics coordinator had been fascinated by Daniel's explanations of crop rotation and resource cycling, recognizing parallels to supply chain management that she had never considered. By the time the transport reached Coalition Fleet Command, Daniel had established a small but growing reputation as someone who could make complex systems work through simple, reliable methods. His approach to problem-solving, methodical observation, followed by carefully tested solutions, had proven valuable in maintaining the ship's life support systems when more sophisticated repair protocols had failed. When he finally reported for duty aboard the Eternal Vigilance, Daniel found himself assigned to quarters in the Civilian Specialist Section, a collection of spaces that felt more like a university dormitory than military housing. His room was small, but functional, equipped with the basic amenities required to keep a human comfortable in the artificial environment of a starship. He unpacked his belongings with the same care he had always used when setting up a new growing space, arranging his tools and references in patterns that would allow for efficient work. The seeds went into a specially designed storage unit that maintained optimal temperature and humidity, each variety carefully labeled and organized according to growing requirements and nutritional value. They represented more than just genetic material for food production. They were a library of biological solutions, each one a product of millennia of adaptation and cultivation by beings who understood that survival often depended on the ability to make things grow in challenging conditions. As Daniel prepared for his first shift in BioBay 7, he understood that he was about to begin the most important growing season of his life. Not because the Coalition forces expected great things from him, but because he suspected that before the war was over, they would discover that the ability to make things grow might be the most crucial skill anyone could possess. Sometimes the most advanced civilizations forgot the most basic truths, and sometimes it took a farmer to remind them that all power ultimately came from the soil. BioBay 7 occupied 3 levels in the agricultural section of the Eternal Vigilance, its hydroponic gardens and atmospheric processors representing the Coalition's commitment to maintaining sustainable food production during extended military operations. The space itself was a marvel of engineering efficiency, with carefully controlled environmental systems that could replicate the growing conditions of dozens of different worlds, nutrient delivery systems that provided precise molecular compositions for optimal plant health, and monitoring networks that tracked every aspect of biological function with scientific precision. Daniel walked through the facility during his first week of assignment, familiarizing himself with systems that bore little resemblance to traditional farming but operated according to principles he understood instinctively. The hydroponic arrays stretched in ordered rows beneath full-spectrum lighting arrays, their roots suspended in nutrient solutions that provided everything necessary for rapid growth and maximum yield. Automated systems monitored pH levels, atmospheric composition, and cellular development with the kind of precision that would have been impossible to achieve through manual cultivation. Yet as impressive as the technology was, Daniel found himself noticing inefficiencies that the designers had apparently overlooked. The nutrient solutions were chemically perfect, but lacked the complex microbial ecosystems that natural soil provided, resulting in plants that grew quickly but possessed limited resistance to environmental stress. The atmospheric controls maintained ideal growing conditions, but failed to account for the subtle variations that helped plants develop stronger cellular structures. The monitoring systems could detect problems with mathematical accuracy, but couldn't prevent issues that any experienced farmer would have anticipated weeks in advance. Captain Jiren made her rounds through Biobay 7 twice each day, inspecting the growing operations with the same attention to detail she applied to weapons maintenance and tactical preparations. Her forearms moved with mechanical precision as she checked production reports and efficiency ratings, her augmented vision analyzing plant development at cellular levels that most organic beings couldn't perceive. To her, the agricultural section was simply another component of the ship's operational systems, no different from the power generators or navigation computers that kept the vessel functioning. Production levels remained within acceptable parameters. She would report to Unit 42 after each inspection, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed that any problem could be solved through proper application of advanced technology. Organic cultivation continues to meet minimum nutritional requirements for crew sustenance. Unit 42's responses carried the cold efficiency of artificial intelligence that measured all biological processes according to mathematical optimization models. Recommendation increased protein synthesis through enhanced growth acceleration protocols. Current organic development cycles are suboptimal compared to synthetic alternatives. Daniel listened to these exchanges while he worked among the plants, adjusting growing conditions and monitoring development patterns that the automated systems couldn't fully understand. He recognized the fundamental flaw in their approach. They were treating agriculture as an industrial process rather than a biological one, assuming that optimal conditions could be maintained through technological control rather than adaptive management. It was the same mistake that had led to agricultural failures throughout galactic history, the belief that superior technology could eliminate the need to understand natural systems. But he also understood that directly challenging their assumptions would accomplish nothing except confirming their impression that he was an ignorant primitive who couldn't comprehend advanced methods. Instead, he focused on subtle improvements to the existing systems, small adjustments that enhanced plant health without triggering the attention of monitoring protocols designed to detect unauthorized modifications. He began by introducing beneficial bacteria cultures to the nutrient solutions, microorganisms that existed below the threshold of detection for most scanning systems, but provided crucial support for root development and nutrient absorption. The changes were gradual enough to appear as natural variation rather than deliberate intervention, but the results were measurable to anyone who understood what to look for. Stronger plants, better resistance to environmental stress, improved nutritional content in the final harvest. The other crew members who worked in Biobay 7 belonged to various species with different approaches to biological management, but most shared the same fundamental assumption that sophisticated technology could eliminate the need for intuitive understanding of living systems. They operated the cultivation equipment with technical competence, but showed little interest in understanding why certain adjustments produced better results than others, treating plant growth as a mechanical process that could be optimized through proper application of scientific principles. Dr. Yinara Thess visited the Biobay occasionally, her ethereal Arcturian form flickering through the growing areas as she conducted inspections for the Science Council. Her seven-lobed brain could process biological data across multiple dimensions, simultaneously analyzing genetic structures and metabolic pathways with capabilities that far exceeded any organic intelligence. Yet, Daniel noticed that she focused exclusively on quantitative measurements, growth rates, nutrient uptake, efficiency, cellular division cycles, while completely missing qualitative factors that determine plant health and productivity. Fascinating, she would murmur as she examined the hydroponic arrays, her consciousness interfacing directly with the monitoring systems to access real-time biological data. The organic cultivation systems demonstrate remarkable consistency despite their primitive methodology. However, analysis suggests significant optimization potential through implementation of advanced genetic modification protocols. Daniel continued his work without commenting, understanding that any explanation of why he was achieving better results through traditional methods would be dismissed as superstition by minds that equated complexity with intelligence. He had learned long ago that the best way to prove the value of practical knowledge was through results rather than arguments, letting the evidence speak for itself while avoiding confrontations that would only reinforce existing prejudices. As the weeks passed, subtle changes began appearing throughout Biobase 7. Plants that had previously shown signs of stress started displaying improved vigor and disease resistance. Harvest yields increased without any modifications to the official growing protocols. Nutritional analysis revealed enhanced vitamin and mineral content in crops that were supposedly being cultivated using identical methods to previous cycles. Unit 42 noted these improvements in its daily reports, with the mechanical precision of artificial intelligence that recorded data without necessarily understanding its significance. Observation agricultural output has exceeded projected parameters by an average of 12.7% over the past 15-day cycle. Analysis suggests potential optimization of existing cultivation protocols. Captain Jiren reviewed these reports with growing interest, though her attention remained focused on practical implications rather than underlying causes. Can these improvements be replicated in other agricultural sections? She asked during one of her inspections. Enhancement protocols remain within standard operational parameters. Unit 42 responded. No modifications to approved cultivation methods have been detected by monitoring systems. Daniel smiled quietly as he adjusted the nutrient flow to a section of bean plants, knowing that the AI sensors weren't designed to detect the kind of subtle biological interventions that made the difference between adequate crops and exceptional ones. The monitoring systems could measure chemical compositions and growth rates with mathematical precision, but they couldn't recognize the signs of healthy soil microbiology or understand how small adjustments to environmental conditions could produce cascading improvements throughout entire growing systems. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was achieving better results through methods that the Coalition's most advanced minds would have dismissed as primitive superstition. But Daniel had learned something during his decades of farming that apparently hadn't made it into their scientific databases. Sometimes the most sophisticated technology worked best when it was guided by simple wisdom rather than complex theories. And as he tended to his plants in the sterile environment of Biobase 7, Daniel began to suspect that the same principle might apply to warfare itself. The hegemony attack came without warning during the night watch, erupting from hyperspace like a malevolent storm that transformed the peaceful void around Coalition Fleet Command into a battlefield measured in light minutes and plasma fire. Daniel felt the eternal vigilance shudder beneath his feet as the ship's massive defensive systems engaged the artificial gravity fluctuating as power was rerouted from non-essential systems to weapons arrays and shield generators. Emergency lighting bathed Biobase 7 in harsh red shadows as automated systems activated crisis protocols designed to protect the agricultural sections during combat operations. Blast doors sealed the growing areas from potential atmospheric breaches, life support systems switched to emergency power, and environmental controls locked onto preset parameters that prioritized basic survival over optimal growing conditions. Daniel moved through the hydroponic arrays with practiced efficiency, his hands checking systems and adjusting controls with the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with agricultural emergencies. While other crew members followed evacuation protocols that moved non-essential personnel to protected areas of the ship, he remained at his post, understanding that the plants under his care couldn't simply be abandoned during a crisis and expected to survive unchanged. The battle raged for 18 hours each minute, marking another escalation in the scale of destruction, as both sides brought increasingly devastating weapons to bear. Through the reinforced viewports of Biobay 7, Daniel could see the distant flashes of energy weapons that could vaporize asteroids, the brief blooms of light that marked the death of entire vessels, the geometric patterns of fleet movements that played out across millions of kilometers of space. Captain Jiren's voice echoed through the ship's communication systems as she coordinated defensive operations from the bridge, her commands carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted the supremacy of superior firepower. Target acquisition confirmed. Deploy quantum torpedo arrays. Authorization for Class 7 destructive protocols approved. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the Coalition's advanced weapons and tactical superiority weren't producing the decisive victory that military doctrine had predicted. The hegemony forces adapted to each new strategy with disturbing efficiency, their ships reconfiguring themselves to counter Coalition tactics almost faster than new orders could be issued. Every advantage gained through technological superiority was neutralized within minutes by enemies who seemed to learn from each engagement. When the shooting finally stopped, the aftermath revealed a tactical situation that challenged every assumption about modern warfare. Both sides had sustained massive casualties, but neither had achieved anything resembling victory. The hegemony forces had withdrawn to regroup, but they had demonstrated capabilities that suggested future engagements would be even more devastating. In the post-battle analysis sessions that followed, Coalition commanders struggled to understand how their technological advantages had failed to produce decisive results. Admiral Voss, the overall fleet commander whose cybernetic implants connected him directly to the ship's tactical systems, reviewed engagement data with growing frustration. Enemy adaptation rates exceeded all predictive models, he reported to the High Command. They appear to possess learning capabilities that allow them to counter our strategies faster than we can implement them. Conventional military doctrine may be insufficient against opponents with such rapid tactical evolution. Dr. Thess added her own analysis from the Science Council's perspective, her 7-lobed brain processing combat data across multiple dimensional frameworks. The enemy demonstrates pattern recognition abilities that suggest either highly advanced artificial intelligence or some form of collective consciousness that enables instantaneous tactical adjustment. Our current approaches may be fundamentally inadequate. While the galaxy's greatest military minds wrestled with strategic problems that defied conventional solutions, Daniel continued his work in Biobay 7, tending to plants that had suffered stress damage from the battle's environmental disruptions. The emergency protocols had maintained basic life support for the growing systems, but 18 hours of suboptimal conditions had taken their toll on crops that required careful environmental balance. He moved through the hydroponic arrays with methodical precision, assessing damage and prioritizing repairs according to principles that had guided farmers through countless disasters. Some plants could recover from brief periods of stress if given proper support, while others needed to be removed before their deterioration affected surrounding crops. The decisions required judgment calls that couldn't be reduced to mathematical formulas, intuitive understanding of biological systems that no AI could replicate. Captain Jiren arrived for her inspection 3 hours after the battle ended, her 4 arms moving with mechanical efficiency as she reviewed production reports and damage assessments. She expected to find significant losses, equipment failures, and requests for replacement resources to restore agricultural operations to pre-battle levels. Instead, she found Daniel working among plants that showed minimal signs of stress damage, their growing systems restored to optimal function through adjustments that weren't reflected in any of the official repair protocols. "Status report, she commanded, her voice carrying the tone of someone prepared to deal with yet another crisis in a day filled with them. "Agricultural systems operational," Daniel replied without looking up from a tomato plant he was examining for signs of nutrient deficiency. Some stress damage to the more sensitive varieties, but overall production levels should return to normal within 48 hours. Captain Jiren's expression showed confusion rather than relief. According to her understanding of biological systems, 18 hours of emergency conditions should have resulted in substantial crop losses and extensive damage to the hydroponic equipment. The fact that the agricultural section had survived the battle with minimal impact defied her expectations about the fragility of organic cultivation methods. "Explain?" she ordered, moving closer to examine the growing systems with enhanced vision that could detect cellular damage invisible to most organic beings. Daniel straightened up, considering how to explain concepts that couldn't be reduced to technical specifications or operational protocols. "Plants are tougher than most people think," he said finally. "They've been surviving environmental stress for millions of years. Sometimes they just need someone who understands how to help them through difficult periods." The explanation clearly frustrated Captain Zirin, who was accustomed to systems that operated according to predictable parameters and responded to problems through predetermined protocols. The idea that biological management might require intuitive understanding rather than technical expertise challenged fundamental assumptions about the superiority of scientific methodology. Unit 42, she commanded, activating the AI's analysis systems. Assess agricultural damage levels and provide recommendations for restoration procedures. Analysis complete. The AI responded after several moments of data processing. Observed damage levels are significantly below projected parameters for environmental stress events of recorded duration and intensity. Recommendation: investigate potential modifications to standard cultivation protocols that may have enhanced system resilience. But Unit 42's sensors weren't designed to detect the subtle interventions that had made the difference, the careful adjustments to nutrient flows that helped plants maintain cellular integrity during stress periods, the microenvironmental modifications that provided protection against atmospheric fluctuations, the biological support systems that couldn't be measured by standard monitoring equipment. As Captain Zarin completed her inspection and moved on to other sections of the ship, Daniel returned to his work with quiet satisfaction. He had proven something important during the battle, not just to the Coalition command structure, but to himself. The skills that some considered primitive and obsolete could still make the difference between success and failure, even in environments where advanced technology was supposed to have eliminated the need for traditional knowledge. And as he tended to his plants in the artificial environment of BioBay, 7, Daniel began to suspect that the same principles might apply to the larger problems facing Coalition forces. Maybe the solution to their tactical difficulties wasn't more sophisticated weapons or advanced strategies, but a return to the fundamental understanding that all complex systems, whether biological or military, operated according to natural laws that couldn't be circumvented through technological superiority alone. Sometimes survival wasn't about having the most advanced tools. Sometimes it was about understanding how to use simple methods effectively when complex systems failed. 3 weeks after the first major engagement, reconnaissance data began revealing patterns that would fundamentally change how the Coalition understood the nature of their enemy. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive supply convoys moving through hegemony-controlled territory, their cargo manifests, suggesting logistical operations on a scale that dwarfed even the Coalition's impressive supply chains. Intelligence analysis revealed something unexpected. Despite their advanced technology and adaptive capabilities, the hegemony forces were dependent on centralized supply systems that followed predictable patterns. Daniel studied these reports during his off-duty hours, poring over logistical data with the same attention to detail he had once applied to soil composition analysis and crop rotation planning. While Coalition strategists focused on the military implications of supply line vulnerabilities, Daniel found himself thinking about the fundamental agricultural principles that governed all biological systems, including the feeding requirements of massive military operations. The data painted a picture of an enemy force that had achieved remarkable tactical flexibility through decentralized command structures and adaptive technologies, but had remained dependent on highly centralized resource production. Their food supplies in particular seemed to come from a relatively small number of agricultural worlds that specialized in high-yield monoculture farming, exactly the kind of system that any experienced farmer would recognize as vulnerable to biological disruption. Captain Jiren arrived in BioBay 7 for her evening inspection to find Daniel working with an unusual collection of seed samples, his hands moving with careful precision as he prepared germination tests for varieties that weren't part of the standard Coalition agricultural inventory. Her enhanced vision could detect the molecular structures of the genetic material he was handling, but the purpose of his experiments remained unclear. "Explain your current activities," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance with requests for information. Daniel looked up from his work, considering how to explain concepts that pushed against the boundaries of conventional agricultural practice. I'm working with some specialized varieties, he said carefully. Seeds from Earth that might be useful if we ever need to establish growing operations in hostile environments. The answer was technically accurate, but deliberately incomplete. What Daniel didn't mention was that he had been studying the biological profiles of hegemony food crops using intelligence data to understand the genetic structures and growth requirements of plants that fed enemy forces across dozens of star systems. His current experiments involve developing organisms that could interact with those crops in ways that would be invisible to standard monitoring systems, but devastating to agricultural productivity. These varieties are not included in approved cultivation protocols. Captain Jiren observed her security training, automatically flagging any deviation from established procedures. Authorization for experimental programs must be obtained through proper channels. I understand, Daniel replied, making no move to halt his work. But I think we might be missing opportunities to use biological approaches to military problems. The hegemony forces have to eat, just like we do. Their supply chains might be more vulnerable than our tactical analysts realize. The suggestion was so far outside conventional military thinking that Captain Jiren initially struggled to process its implications. Coalition strategy focused on destroying enemy forces through superior firepower and tactical brilliance, not on disrupting their agricultural systems through biological warfare. The idea that food production could be weaponized challenged fundamental assumptions about how conflicts were fought and won. Biological warfare protocols are regulated by Galactic Convention agreements. She responded, falling back on established doctrine when faced with concepts that exceeded her strategic training. Coalition forces are prohibited from deploying weapons that target civilian populations or essential infrastructure. Daniel's hands never stopped moving as he carefully planted test samples in specialized growing medium that replicated the soil conditions found on hegemony agricultural worlds. I'm not talking about biological weapons, he said quietly. I'm talking about agricultural science, competition between different plant species, natural selection, the same processes that have been shaping ecosystems for millions of years. What he was actually developing was far more sophisticated than traditional biological warfare and far more subtle than anything that would trigger international restrictions on weapons of mass destruction. The organisms he was cultivating were designed to form symbiotic relationships with existing hegemony crops, providing apparent benefits while gradually altering soil chemistry in ways that would reduce long-term agricultural productivity. The process would take months to show results and years to cause serious problems, but it would be virtually undetectable until the damage was already irreversible. Over the following weeks, Daniel's unofficial research expanded as he gained access to additional intelligence data about hegemony agricultural systems. He learned that their food production was dominated by a single genus of grain that had been genetically modified for maximum yield and rapid growth, but which lacked the genetic diversity that would provide resistance to environmental challenges. Their entire supply chain was optimized around this one crop, with backup systems that relied on synthetic alternatives that could only be produced in specialized industrial facilities. It was, from an agricultural perspective, exactly the kind of system that invited catastrophic failure. Any disruption to the primary grain production would cascade through their entire food supply network, while damage to the industrial facilities that produce synthetic alternatives would eliminate their backup options. The hegemony had achieved impressive efficiency through specialization, but had sacrificed the resilience that came from agricultural diversity. The opportunity was obvious to anyone who understood both farming and warfare, but it required someone willing to operate outside conventional military doctrine and accept personal responsibility for actions that couldn't be officially authorized. Daniel spent long hours considering the implications of what he was contemplating, understanding that success would require him to put himself at enormous personal risk while operating without support from coalition command structures. The decision came during a briefing about upcoming offensive operations, when Admiral Voss outlined plans for a direct assault on hegemony defensive positions that would almost certainly result in massive casualties on both sides. As Daniel listened to tactical discussions that focused exclusively on firepower and strategic positioning, he realized that the coalition was preparing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives in a conventional battle when a single individual with the right knowledge could potentially end the war without firing a shot. That night, he submitted a request for assignment to a reconnaissance mission that would place him within range of hegemony agricultural worlds. The request was buried in routine personnel transfer documents and approved without significant review, just another minor adjustment to crew assignments that wouldn't warrant the attention of senior command staff. As he prepared for the mission that would either end the war or cost him his life, Daniel packed his equipment with the same methodical care he had always used when preparing for planting season. Seeds went into specialized containers that would protect them during space travel and maintain their viability in hostile environments. Biological samples were secured in storage systems that would prevent contamination while allowing for controlled release when the time came. And tucked among his personal effects was a small collection of organisms that represented 43 years of agricultural knowledge, biological solutions to problems that the galaxy's greatest military minds had never considered. The tools that would prove that sometimes the most devastating weapons were the ones that grew slowly and quietly, changing the world one seed at a time. The war was about to discover that a farmer with the right knowledge could be more dangerous than an entire fleet of battleships. Silent approach slipped away during fleet movements, carrying Daniel toward Kepler Agricultural Zone. For 12 days, he refined biological samples designed to interact invisibly with enemy systems. Kepler showcased hegemony resource management, entire worlds converted to single-purpose farms, ecosystems replaced by monocultures stretching pole to pole. Orbital stations processed harvests, feeding operations across star systems. Commander Yates positioned them at Sensor Network's edge. Target is Kepler 7 main grain facility. Supplies 40% of hegemony food requirements. Daniel studied displays showing installations covering continental areas, automated systems managing production with industrial efficiency. Perfect scale for catastrophic biological failure. Maintenance facility on night side. Connected to distribution network but lightly secured. Extraction depends on timing. Neither said extraction might be impossible if discovered. Daniel's mission required weeks to show effects, months for serious disruption. Daniel infiltrated as displaced agricultural worker with fabricated documentation. For 3 weeks, he worked among massive systems, carefully deploying organisms appearing beneficial while creating long-term degradation. Biological agents were marvels of engineering, improving short-term yields while depleting soil nutrients, enhancing stress resistance while reducing reproductive viability. Effects would accumulate, slowly creating problems apparent only after spreading throughout networks. Discovery came during routine security sweep. Biological anomalies led to investigation revealing organisms not in databases. Daniel was captured attempting final deployment. 3 weeks later, reports reached coalition intelligence about mysterious crop failures. Agricultural yields declining rapidly across systems, soil contamination defying treatment. Food supplies sustaining enemy forces for decades were failing simultaneously. Zirin received reports with mechanical precision. For the first time since war began, Coalition possessed advantages that couldn't be countered through adaptation or technology. Enemy food production compromised to a degree requiring significant resource reallocation within 6 months, Unit 42 reported. As reports documented agricultural collapse, Zirin thought about the human who'd maintained their food production with quiet competence. Skills keeping Biobase 7 operational had apparently destroyed agricultural foundation of interstellar military operation. For the first time in her career, she questioned whether superior firepower was always the most effective approach. Intelligence reports arrived regularly reflecting agricultural warfare's growing strategic importance. Zirin reviewed analyses showing disruption exceeding conventional operations projections. Hegemony agricultural output declined 67% across systems, Unit 42 reported. Enemy forces implementing emergency rationing, redirecting military resources to recovery. Numbers showed disruption no firepower could achieve. Enemy fleets withdrawn from offensive positions to guard scarce food convoys. Agricultural worlds that operated with minimal security now protected like major bases. Dr. Thess materialized analyzing biological data. Organism distributions suggest systematic planning exceeding individual capability. Agents designed to interact with specific genetic markers found exclusively in hegemony crops. Admiral Voss listened with satisfaction and unease. Strategic advantages were undeniable. Coalition possessed initiative for the first time. Enemy capabilities, declining measurably tactical options constrained by supply limitations, worsening as contamination spread. But methods challenged assumptions about civilized warfare. Coalition prided itself on superior technology, winning through capabilities exceeding enemy potential rather than attacking civilian infrastructure. Recommend expanded biological warfare protocols, Unit 42 suggested. Agricultural disruption could be deployed against additional territory, potentially ending hostilities within standard year. The suggestion challenged coalition principles. They'd entered defending civilization against enemies using terror and biological weapons. Galactic Convention prohibits biological warfare against civilians, Admiral Voss reminded participants. Analysis suggests agents target agricultural systems rather than populations directly. Dr. Thess responded. Classification may fall outside convention restrictions. Distinction was accurate but morally ambiguous. Organisms weren't designed to kill directly, but food production collapse would force choices between military operations and civilian survival. Intelligence specified Daniel remained in hegemony custody. Interrogation reports suggest enemy forces attempting countermeasure development, but analysis indicates limited success. His information value protected him from execution. Enemy forces needed understanding what he'd done before hoping to reverse agricultural damage. Strategic situation evolved favoring coalition forces, enemy operations increasingly constrained by supply limitations forcing difficult choices. Offensive operations suspended for defensive positions protecting remaining agricultural assets. The war was ending through slow biological collapse rather than decisive battles. Enemy discovering armies without adequate food couldn't maintain combat regardless of weapons technology. Jiren received authorization implementing agricultural warfare training, preparing specialists, replicating Daniel's methods for future conflicts. But reviewing curriculum transforming agricultural science into military doctrine, she wondered whether strategic advantages came at cost of something fundamental. The Galactic War ended, not with thunderous clashes, but quiet acknowledgement that continued resistance had become biologically impossible. 6 months after Daniel's infiltration, enemy forces requested ceasefire negotiations based on humanitarian concerns. Their civilization faced starvation threatening species survival. Final negotiations occurred in neutral space near Rigel system. Coalition representatives arrived with victorious confidence, hegemony delegates with desperate recognition that technological superiority meant nothing when biological systems failed. Admiral Voss led coalition delegation with satisfaction, tempered by unease about victory methods. Strategic advantages were undeniable. Enemy forces rendered incapable of sustained operations through food supply disruption. Negotiations proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Hostilities ceased boundaries, redrawn monitoring frameworks established. But underlying discussions was recognition that war's outcome had been determined by factors existing protocols hadn't anticipated. Hegemony representatives requested technical assistance addressing agricultural contamination, threatening civilian survival, acknowledging their biotechnology couldn't reverse damage caused by organisms designed according to principles they didn't understand. When Daniel returned to coalition custody, 6 months, imprisonment had affected his condition, but not his quiet determination. Medical examinations revealed interrogation evidence, but confirmed captors ensured survival, because they needed his knowledge. 1 year later, Intergalactic Strategy Academy unveiled the manual archive dedicated to preserving practical knowledge nearly lost to technological sophistication pursuit. Above its entrance, carved in stone, "Read the manual." The inscription became cultural phenomenon, appearing on textbooks to toys. It symbolized practical knowledge value over theoretical complexity wisdom from understanding systems rather than operating them. More importantly, it sparked fundamental change in how the galaxy viewed knowledge. Universities required practical engineering courses, hands-on learning connecting theory to reality. Students previously focused exclusively on advanced physics now learned hand tools and schematics. The war's conclusion ushered in the great rebalancing cultural shift, recognizing progress wasn't just building complex systems, but maintaining wisdom to operate them responsibly. Coalition worlds implemented agricultural diversity requirements, mandating resilient food systems, surviving biological attacks. New policies represented shift from maximum efficiency toward survival-prioritized approaches. The Galactic Agricultural Academy established the Daniel Cooper Memorial Center for Sustainable Food Systems, researching productivity balanced with security concerns. It housed biological samples throughout known space, maintaining genetic diversity, supporting recovery after disasters. Years later, historians analyzing war factors consistently identified Daniel's biological warfare program as the decisive element shifting strategic balance toward coalition forces. His methods proved individual expertise, properly applied, could accomplish more than massive military operations. But for those who knew Daniel during Eternal Vigilance service, the most important lesson was simpler. Jiren included it in her final report. True power lies not in weapon complexity, but understanding depth. The ability to control life, making things grow or fail, represents strength no technology can replicate. Humans possess this power because they remember all complex systems depend on simple foundations that must be respected rather than dominated. The war was over. The galaxy had been saved by someone understanding that seeds properly planted could grow into forces no army could resist. In agricultural stations throughout coalition space, farmers continued work with new appreciation for truth. Daniel Cooper had proven sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that grow slowly and change everything. These sci-fi stories remind us that in a universe often overlooking the humble and patient we need, reminders that smallest seeds can grow into mightiest trees. The galaxy is vast, but quiet courage of ordinary people makes it worth saving. If this story of quiet strength, triumphing over overwhelming force, has moved you, if it reminds you that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources and true power lies in understanding rather than domination, then share this tale with others who appreciate the profound in the simple. Hit that like button and subscribe, because in a universe that often overlooks the humble and patient, we all need reminders that the smallest seeds can grow into the mightiest trees. The galaxy is vast, but it is the quiet courage of ordinary people that makes it worth saving.